Would it surprise you to know that more than 300 million people worldwide struggle with depression? This statistic comes from the World Health Organization, and that the United States alone has 6.2 million people that have had a major depressive episode in the last year. Why should you care? Sadly, these numbers don't include those that suffer with depression but never receive a diagnosis or treatment due to mental health stigma. Depression is completely treatable, but only half of those diagnosed receive treatment, and of those that get treated, the majority put it off for several months or years. The single greatest risk of untreated depression is suicide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in people aged 15 to 25, and 10th overall. How would I know this? I have depression. Do you know how long I waited to get treatment? 7 years. I waited 7 years to get help. At first, I didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't recognize it for what it was. And after being diagnosed, I didn't get sufficient help because I didn't want to seem weak. I didn't want to give up my illusion of independence. I didn't want to be judged, and I was afraid of being seen as a bad mom. I was concerned with what people thought of me, and I didn't want anyone to know how broken I was. I got help not because I wanted it for myself, but because I had the help of many people that loved me. Let me be clear, treatment takes time, and it's more of a mental health formula, and it's not one size fits all. It's not a one-stop shop to feeling better and whole. Help me to remove the stigma by learning the signs, symptoms, and treatment of depression. First, let's address stigma. What comes to mind when you think about depression? What do you expect someone with depression to look like? How do they act? Do they have the poor pity me, I want to die stereotype shown in movies and TV? Do they have to have a reason for why they feel the way they do? Aren't they just crazy and weird and negative? Stigma has 3 driving forces behind it: discrimination, ignorance, and prejudice. People are prevented from seeking help and going to treatment before they ever get a diagnosis. The strength of social stigma attached to depression keeps those that know what's wrong from getting help because they are afraid of what they will lose. Social discrimination is real and costs some people their jobs, and at worst, their lives. So what is depression? Depression is a mood disorder. Different types of depression have different underlying causes, and there are some differences in the symptoms and in the treatments. In order to receive a diagnosis, you must have at least 5 of the following symptoms for however long. Irritable or depressed mood for most of the day. Unintended weight loss or gain. Hypersomnia, which is sleeping too much, or insomnia, sleeping not enough. A loss of energy or fatigue, lack of interest or pleasure in previously enjoyable activities. Feelings of excessive guilt, inadequacy, and worthlessness. Diminished concentration, indecisiveness. Physical slowness or agitation, or recurring thoughts of death. Another set of symptoms that are more worrying are those which point to a person at greater risk of suicide. Social isolation, sudden cheerfulness or calm after a depressive episode. Exaggerated complaints about pain and aches. Frequent use of drugs and alcohol. Neglect of duties such as caring for pets, finances, the house, or yourself. Giving away precious mementos or getting their affairs in order. recent psychological trauma such as divorce or death of a loved one, a family history of suicide, talking about death or suicide, and most worrying of all, buying a gun. I have two different kinds of depression, or I have had two different kinds of depression in my life. I started with postpartum depression after my second was born. He was about 6 months old, and I had a 2-year-old or 2.5-year-old, nearly 3-year-old daughter. I was very agitated and irritable. I struggled with near constant feelings of worthlessness and inadequacy. I dismissed my symptoms of fatigue and lack of sleep because, really, I'm a mom with a baby that didn't sleep a whole lot. I spent my whole life not knowing believing that depression was, and postpartum in particular, was the crying and I don't like my baby, the irrational sadness. I also didn't believe that postpartum was possible with how old my baby was. And in reality, postpartum depression can occur up until the baby is a year old. I knew that something was wrong, but I had no idea what could possibly turn me from being my usually reasonable and calm self into a raging banshee that screamed irrationally about things like cereal being spilt on the floor. For me, depression meant that my emotional self was beating my rational self in 7 out of 10 occasions. This left life feeling very chaotic and stressful as I battled to keep my banshee in check. The problem was that once she was raging, she was difficult to get back in her box. You literally had to wait until the emotional storm had passed before you could talk to me. Down the line, my depression morphed into clinical depression, mostly because it never went away. Some of my symptoms became more severe, and I started adding some of the scarier ones. When I figured out I had postpartum depression, I went to a doctor. I got diagnosed, and I received treatment. I learned some coping strategies that helped me feel a little less crazy, and I finally had an explanation for why I felt the way that I did. And I wasn't just crazy. I declined medication, not just because I was still breastfeeding, but because I had a personal stigma against it. I believed meds were for the weak-willed and that they were a further sign of failure. There are several kinds of treatments available for depression. The most successful of which is a combination of medication and talk therapy. Other options for treating depression include light therapy, exercise, eating healthy, getting adequate sleep, and in extreme cases, electroconvulsive therapy, which is usually a last resort after medications don't help. My first round of treatment was exclusively psychotherapy or talk therapy. It worked well. It gave me the tools I needed to help me cope with my postpartum depression. Stigma reared its head, though, when my therapist requested that my husband attend one of my sessions, but he refused. He believed that it was exclusively my problem to fix, and he couldn't understand why I couldn't just be happy. Later, I had lost many of the tools I had previously learned and fell further into my depressive fog. Ultimately, it was the efforts of my husband that saved me. He could tell things had gotten worse and that I needed to get help. This time around, he was more supportive, and he finally began to understand that I wasn't choosing to feel the way I did. And still sometimes do. This time, he tattled to my mom, who convinced me that it was okay to be on medication. That it wasn't any different from taking pills for heart disease or receiving insulin shots for diabetes. My husband's mom worked for my doctor, and she booked me an appointment and told me that when I needed to show up. I had to try a few kinds of medication before I found one that worked for me, and I restarted therapy. My aha moment that the medication was wonderful and truly meant to help people. I woke up about 10 days into taking the medication, and when I woke up happy. I thought to myself, as soon as I woke up happy, wait, what? I thought I was happy. Dang. I forgot what happy really feels like. I'm no longer on medication, but I wouldn't change the fact that I did. I'm now in maintenance mode. At the end of the day, the things that work best to help me manage my depression are exercise, eating regular meals, getting enough sleep, taking breaks, reading my scriptures, making attainable goals, not letting negative experiences wreck the rest of my day, and learning that my best looks different every single day. Sometimes I will accomplish all the things that I set out to do, and other days I'm lucky if I knocked 2 things off the list. This time around, my husband was and is supportive. He works to be understanding and no longer reinforces the negative thoughts in my head with his comments about how neglected the house looks, or his guilt about the times when I take a needed break or ask for some space. So what can you do with this information? Help me remove the stigma attached to depression. Have empathy. Have sympathy. Be kind. Take the time to learn the signs and remember the things that help. Not just because someday you might have depression, but because someone you love might. And you might just save a life. It saved mine.